that most human beings do, in fact, turn to these big general questions about why we're here, what the purpose of our life is. Can we know what it's right to do? Are there any objective standards of rightness, or are we just on our own with our subjective feelings and projections? So there's certain central questions which I would say are fundamental to the human condition.
So hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Anagoge podcast. I know it has been a very long time since the last episode. I've been a bit busy with work last year, but this year I'm really kind of making a commitment to doing more episodes, and I have an excellent guest to kind of start this revival. So just before we get into it, it's just a small announcement. I have published a book called In Search of the Infinite, a psychedelic memoir. I've been writing it for the last 7 years. It's available on Amazon. It's about philosophy and religion. Likely a lot of overlap with this conversation that you're about to hear, but also my podcast more broadly on questions of human meaning and human existence, things like that. So if you want more details about that, I will explain a bit more about the book at the end of the podcast, but I just wanted to get this out of the way. Welcome, John Cottingham. It's truly a pleasure to have you here.
Very nice to be here.
Amazing. And also, I first got to know you during my undergrad degree in philosophy. So I was actually, I think I actually did some essays on your work, although now I kind of forgot what they were because my memory isn't great and it was a while ago. And then last year, when I was in a bookshop, I kind of saw this little book. Well, in your case, it's a little blurred, so for you it'll be hard to tell, but it's In Search of the Soul. So I just saw this book on the shelf. And so the name caught my attention because it's something I'm interested in. But then I recognized the name as well. Oh, actually, I know this person. So I got it, and it was super enjoyable. And that's kind of what made me look a little bit deeper into your work. And that's why I invited you here. So it's really great. And so, yeah, maybe before we start, maybe you can give just a very concise, very short introduction about yourself and your work. I like to let people do that themselves, especially when they have such a long career, because then you can pick what you think is relevant and most meaningful to you.
Yes, thanks. Well, I started my philosophy interests when I was still at school, but then at Oxford, I did the so-called Mods and Greats course, which meant Latin and Greek for the first 2 years, and then philosophy mainly for the second two. As a PhD student or DPhil student, I studied Descartes, and my doctoral thesis was on Descartes. And really, for the first phase in my career, I worked mainly on the 17th century, Descartes, but also Leibniz, Spinoza, the rationalists, as they are called. I increasingly became interested in moral philosophy and also philosophical psychology, particularly psychoanalytic theory. And from there, it kind of segued into philosophy of religion, which had always been a background interest. But the last 20 years or so, that's probably been my principal research interest, starting with questions, so rather grand questions about the meaning of life, purpose of human existence, but moving on to the relationship between religion and spirituality, the moral life, the spiritual life, and also how religious belief connects with other areas of our worldview. Our moral outlook, and of course with what science tells us about the cosmos. So the most recent work, as you mentioned, is In Search of the Soul, which I did for Princeton University Press 2 or 3 years ago. And then more recently still, the humane perspective. I'll just imitate you and just hold up a copy, which is published by Oxford University Press last year. And that deals with a whole variety of issues connected with the interrelation between religion, morals, science, and what I call the humane perspective, which is trying to advocate a broader conception of philosophical inquiry. So instead of being narrowly analytic in the sense merely concerned with abstract argumentation, it tries to draw on all the resources of the human mind, including the emotional, affective dimension, but also drawing on literary and poetic resources as well, which seem to me all to feed into our philosophical understanding.
Right. Okay. Amazing. Yeah, I particularly find it's kind of when you mention emotion, and I'll also kind of like seeing that some of your work touches on that. I find that a bit perplexing, and I hope we have a bit time to get into that. But so first of all, just as a disclaimer, my questions are going to be a little bit disjointed out of each other, just because our time is very short. So I'm trying to just prioritize the things that I find most interesting and just kind of like try to get to them. So while I was kind of like diving a bit deeper into your work, I remember one experience when I was watching, one of your lectures, and everything like made perfect sense to me. But because again, I think we have very similar views on a lot of these things. But it kind of occurred to me that a lot of it would be unintelligible to the average person, I think. And not because of the quality of the lecture, I think it was excellent, and also not because it has jargon. It was also very minimal. It's more in the sense of it's a very alien way of thinking and of looking at the world, and I think especially the case for non-philosophers, because for example in your lecture, something that you do that I love and that you do very often is kind of like make references to other philosophers, so that it kind of clicks a little bit what you're trying to say, and kind of highlight how other people have thought the same. But and so for example, if I'm watching the lecture, and you mentioned a specific concept of Heidegger, for example, to help me understand a little bit what you're saying, I'm like, oh, okay, now I understand this a little bit better. But obviously, the average person doesn't know who Heidegger is, and so obviously you could explain that to them. But then it's this extra piece of the conversation that now you have to deal with, and then things just kind of expand very quickly if you do that. So even though I think your arguments and your line of thinking is very well, I think it is quite difficult for the average person. And again, I'm not saying this in the flaw of your person or your argumentation. I think it's just kind of universal of the topic. So how do you think is the best way to kind of like bridge that gap, in particular for people that don't have kind of like a traditional education in philosophy, in theology, or even the humanities in general?
Mm. Yeah, that's a very important question. I'm glad you suggested that you found the work fairly clear and accessible, because that's always been a great aim of mine, to try and communicate as clearly as possible. And I believe a lot of contemporary academic philosophy has become inaccessible because it's taken refuge in a lot of technicalities, in very abstract forms of argumentation, and also in smaller and smaller little research areas, which are perhaps of interest to other specialists, but not to a wider readership. I very much believe philosophy should be a synoptic discipline. That's to say, it should not just look at very minute technical problems, but should take a wide, if you like, a holistic view. And this old word, world view, I mean, it's true, I suppose, that most non-academic people don't think very much about a worldview or a grand philosophical theory. But I think actually, although it may be only occasionally or when they have free time, that most human beings do, in fact, turn to these big general questions about why we're here, what the purpose of our life is. Can we know what it's right to do? Are there any objective standards of rightness, or are we just on our own with our subjective feelings and projections? So there's certain central questions which I would say are fundamental to the human condition. And all I think philosophers should do is to try to articulate those as clearly and accessibly as possible. But I don't see it as a specialized discipline separate from the concerns that we all have as human beings. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So yeah, although my concern is like, even though, I think how to phrase it. Even though obviously I agree with you, and I think that's absolutely fundamental and important. I think one of the issues that I was trying more to get is also that even though the concern is universal, it's still it's still a hard conversation, because the way that they frame the topic is very different because of the culture that we're in, right? So they come in with a different set of suppositions about what religion is, what philosophy is, what God is, all kinds of things, right? And then it is our job as I'm not a philosopher, but in the sense of doing philosophy or talking philosophy, it's our job to kind of like make them see from a particular angle, but that angle is just so alien to them. So even though I think you're absolutely right that there's a fundamental human nature for the transcendent and for religion in general, I just think it's just become such a hard conversation to have. And I'm sure you've experienced this as well, right? With like, outside the philosophy environment, you're talking with friends or you're talking with family, and a lot of them are like, I just don't understand
Yeah.
where you're coming from, basically.
Yeah. I mean, we all come to any discussion with preconceptions based on our individual histories. And I think a lot of people come to religion um, either from the standpoint of fairly dogmatic commitments, that it's something they determined to defend at all costs, or on the other side, feeling very alienated from it, perhaps because they've been hurt by religion as children or when they were growing up, or they feel that they were led into something which they accepted too easily, too readily. So there may be preconceptions both in favor and against religion. To some extent, I try in my work to move off these questions of doctrine and to try and connect with issues we all share. For example, I think most of us have at some moment in our lives been filled with feelings of wonder at nature, perhaps the starry heavens at night, or the beauties of the natural world in spring, for example, as we see it now. So those are very broadly common human experiences. And I think those do connect with the religious impulse, which starts with, as many philosophers have said, following Aristotle, really starts with wonder. Well, he said philosophy starts with wonder. I think the same is true of religion. And also a sense of awe, A-W-E, ah, to give it the American pronunciation. That's to say, a sense of our insignificance uh, as we confront something far greater than us. So I don't think those are sort of difficult or technical ideas. I think I'm trying there to get at, if you like, a common ground. which we share as we confront the mystery of existence. Philosophers may go on about it more, or may reflect on it more, or try to articulate it more. But I don't. I would hate to think that this kind of philosophical work I'm doing is difficult. I don't think these ideas are difficult. One needs time. One needs to reflect on them. And of course, many people are very busy and caught up in the necessities of living. And we are a relatively privileged minority in the developed world in that we have time for these questions.
Right.
But I think these questions are endemic to our human nature, so that given suitable time and resources, they would impinge on any thoughtful human being.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Although I find it kind of funny when you mention that when you frame it as like the pathway to philosophy / religion is awe, because I actually frame it quite differently. I think to some degree, well, yeah, well, awe is not exactly only positive, especially kind of within the tradition of the Bible. There's a certain element of terror and overwhelmingness that is associated with awe. But generally speaking, I would say it's a bit positive. But I would say that the start of religion, at least to me, and from just what I read and kind of like the worldview that I've gathered, is that it actually starts in suffering more than awe. And from my experience, that actually drives people more to religion than awe, I think. Because I think awe is more easily secularizable. I messed up that word, but kind of like put in secular terms. But thanks for the answer. That was great. And also, when we're talking about worldviews and whatnot, something related is, in order to try to assess what the religious worldview is like, you've mentioned many times that we need a new epistemology of religion, and we're too attached and too tied to kind of what we think the methods of philosophy are, which is already a can of worms, especially after 20th century, and also of science as well, which then influenced philosophy very heavily. And at least for myself in my work, I've often spoken about, in a fairly hostile manner, about the current cultural climate that is largely driven by science, and I think that produces an overly scientific picture of reality. But I don't see that same level of hostility in you, and I'm not sure if it's more about politeness or you just see the problem slightly differently. But the way that I see you sometimes talk about it is that there's science over here, which is all good and it works great and it's true in the scientific sense. And then there's religion over here, and we just need to look here, and then we'll see that there's this equally valid worldview of the world. But I think it's actually much problematic than that, because I think science is already a distortion of human intelligibility about the world. And and this sounds very dramatic, but I think it's true to some degree. I think it kind of poisons your mind a little bit, and then because you have these glasses of science, then you miss what religion is about, which is the default state of the human condition. So I think it's way more problematic than just an alternative view. So I'm just curious, kind of like how you frame science in this whole dilemma.
Yeah. Well, you've raised a lot of very interesting points there. Thank you. I don't think scientific theories are distortions. I mean, you're right, I think, in identifying a positive response to science in my writing. I do regard it as one of humanity's greatest achievements, and one that has benefited us immeasurably, although it's also brought risks. But to give one example, the advance of medical science is something many of us have great reason to be thankful for. I think the distortion comes when it's taken as the sole touchstone of truth and reality. So where people say, unless this can be expressed scientifically, it's not a valid truth. Science does not capture the whole of reality. There are truths which are expressed, for example, in poetry, truths connected with personal relationships, with art, with music, which you could give a scientific description of what's going on, but that would leave so much out. For example, a scientific description of music would be about frequencies of sound, responses in the brain, electrical activity in the brain. All that's true, that is happening when you or I listen to music, but it doesn't begin to touch the qualities that are so important in the lives of those who love music, which are just as much part of reality as the scientifically describable bits. And to some extent, I think I agree with your reservations you expressed towards the end of your remarks. After all, these scientific equations, the mathematical equations describing the quantities, the frequencies, the fluctuations, the atomic vibrations, these are quantitative abstractions which don't capture the human reality in which we live, that what's sometimes called the Lebenswelt in German, the life world that you and I inhabit as we're talking to each other, as we're eating and drinking and interacting. Going back to the earlier part of your remarks, I think you're right that suffering can be a crucial catalyst in leading someone to a religious view of the world. Wittgenstein, who has influenced me a fair bit, and I think it's actually regrettable that Wittgenstein's influence has faded a bit recently in philosophy, being rather replaced with a very scientistic conception of truth. Wittgenstein said that life can educate you to believing in God. And by life, he explicitly mentioned sufferings of various sorts. I think the point about that is that suffering can be a kind of catalyst. It can soften people, open people's sensibility so that parts of reality that before were hidden start to become visible. And this connects with what you said at the beginning, the new epistemological model that I'm trying to promote, which I call an epistemology of receptivity. That's to say, a view of knowledge which suggests that rather than remaining detached observers, always scrutinizing, criticizing, evaluating, there may be other modes of awareness which require a certain openness for the relevant properties and facts to be discerned. The American philosopher Martha Nussbaum said that for example, gave a very good example, I think, from literature. In experiencing a great novel or poem, she said, we have to be porous, like blotting paper, prepared to give ground, to soak up to the material, to receive it in order to discern it properly. If we always remain step back, analyzing, criticizing in a kind of left brain way, to use that useful shorthand, then we're cutting ourselves off from perceiving it properly. So there is a genuine form of knowledge, I think, which requires more than the scientific method, well, something else than the scientific method.
Right. Yeah, amazing. Yeah, that makes total sense. And kind of continuing kind of this thread of science, something else that I wanted to get your thoughts about is that a very common claim is that the theistic worldview is not necessarily in opposition to science. And to some degree, that's a fairly basic proposition within like a fairly educated, sophisticated theistic worldview. So obviously, we can kind of like set aside the character of religion of like, evolution isn't true, the earth is 6,000 years old, and so on and so forth. And so in one way that's all true, but I think that also oversimplifies things a lot, because if you claim that you're a theist, then at least one thing that you have to kind of accept at the bare minimum is kind of like this binary, Boolean state of God exists or God is true in some degree. And then again, you can say God exists, God is true, and there's all this science, and that's all fine. The problem, I think, is that at least within a Christianity context, that concept, number one, the concept of God, and number two, the concept of Christianity itself, that doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a tradition, and it exists in a worldview. And so if you claim that you're a theist, you kind of have to make the claim a little bit, oversimplify things a little bit for the sake of argument, that is the God of Christianity. And that sits within a certain historical and cultural context. And then you have to, and then that leads to the proposition, the very basic proposition of Christianity, that Jesus is the Son of God. And if you want, and I think you can do this to a great degree, I'm still trying to figure out to what degree you can do this, but you can secularize Christianity a fair bit. Like you can say, religion is about, kind of like, and trying to sketch out some kind of ideal behavior, kind of like the ideal human being, and then Christ is this like, the embodiment of this ideal. So let's just follow Christ. But at the end of the day, it's just a human being. It's just a teacher, right? But that's not what Christianity claims at all. It's central to its identity that it is the Son of God. And so you have to take that to some degree, or at least you have to wrestle with it. And if that's the case, then this simplistic dismissal of the conflict between science and religion becomes a bit more difficult to grapple. Because again, if we're talking about God, that needs to sit in the context of Christianity, and then you have to grapple with the identity of Christianity, which is very, very reliant on, number one, Christ, and also the resurrection of Christ, from the dead, at the bare minimum. Like if you want to constrain the problem to its barest minimum. And so given all of this, then you do have that kind of conflict. It's very hard to avoid. And so what do you do in such a situation? Like how do you tackle this?
Great question. First of all, I think you're absolutely right. We have to operate within a tradition. There's no point of leverage to lever ourselves out of our culture so we can look down and say that religion is true, that one's false. That we are, as human beings, part of a living tradition, a cultural tradition. So I think we just have to accept that. Now, science has revealed a remarkable world, a world which can be characterized using these intricate mathematical equations which yield very accurate predictions. Amazingly, the universe appears to be describable using the tools of logic and mathematics. And that is a remarkable fact, I think, which is, I think, at the very least compatible with a theistic worldview, indeed with a Christian worldview, because Christianity says in the fourth gospel, in the beginning was the Logos. And Logos, as you know, has been variously translated, but it's word, intelligence, reason, rationality, the divine creative intelligence. So it's a picture which I think doesn't at all say that science is wrong. On the contrary, it would, if there is logos, rationality at the heart of existence, we would expect the universe not to be a random mess of events, but to be intelligible. So that's the first thing, the intelligibility of the cosmos. The question of the incarnation takes us perhaps outside philosophy proper into the realm of theology. And there is a mystery about that. The incarnation has always been understood within the theological tradition to be a mystery. In fact, René Descartes in the 17th century said that it was rather like creation out of nothing, a mystery. In fact, he said there were three mysteries: creation out of nothing, the incarnation, God became human, and free will. So that, for what it's worth, those were his three mysteries. But again, I'm not sure I would agree with you in saying there's an either or choice there, because God is understood as the source of all existence. In Thomas Aquinas, for example, God is pure being, the mysterious principle that makes the difference between things existing and things not existing. And it doesn't seem to me to be absurd or unintelligible that mysterious source of being and goodness should manifest itself in particular events. There's a complicated theological question about whether God, as it were, breaks in to the natural order or works through the natural order. And I think some of your questions about incarnation and resurrection relate to that. But perhaps I've said enough to indicate why I'm not convinced that there's a radical opposition here between science and religion.
Yeah, I can understand that, to some degree, and obviously there's no, it's not the best phrasing, but there's no logical inconsistency about the two, obviously, because again, if you're talking about, kind of the ultimate creator, the ground of being, however you want to call it, like obviously if you take that assumption, or at least the type of being that we think that has and the type of qualities that it has within our theological tradition, like obviously that would be possible, but I think that conflict does exist because it forces you to admit that the laws of nature can be broken, and maybe they can, and there's no necessarily logical impossibility of that occurring. I think Hume made a very good argument for that. But from a scientific perspective, that is, it's either completely absurd and you're automatically left out of what's acceptable within science, or at the very least, they question your whole system. They question your whole epistemology, which is like, sure, it's logically possible, but like on what possible grounds do you have that compared to our entire scientific understanding of the world?
Yeah. Well, I think you put that very persuasively, if I may say so. But the problem for me is that you're trying to get an answer by extracting a given proposition from a whole framework and saying, look, is it or is it not true? I mean, here's an analogy. Um, Consider the Mass, the Catholic Mass, the Eucharist. Um, Now, you can ask a question like, is this bread or is it not the body of Christ? And you can pose that in such a way that you say, well, science shows that there's been no change in the bread. So therefore, you're forced to choose either the scientific view or the religious view. But actually, I think it's very misleading to think we can isolate propositions in that way and subject them to that kind of either or question. To understand the Eucharist, you have to understand the whole context. I mean, this is a Wittgensteinian point again. Wittgenstein said, we can't understand the meaning of a sentence in isolation from the whole language game, the whole form of life in which it operates. So you have to ask for the meaning of these claims, not just say, are they or are they not true? Because that's, as it were, forcing the thing into a verificationist scientific mold. The meaning of the incarnation, I would say, I'm not a theologian, so, but I would say the meaning of the incarnation is to be understood in the context of the whole life of Christ, his moral teachings. It's not a magical thing which you have to say, is it or did it not happen? Did it or did it not break the laws of nature? Its significance has to be understood in a context, in the context of the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, and the same for the subsequent faith of the church. So I think this again gets back to what I was saying at the beginning about a holistic or synoptic understanding of these of the claims of religion. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I totally understand where you're coming from. I do think there's some problems with it. I think it's very complicated. And just for clarification, I'm not really particularly interested in this like verificationist like position. I do think that it's misguided, somewhat similar to you, but I view it more misguided, not in the sense that it's not a question that you should ask, not in the sense that it's not something with an answer, but more in the sense that you're looking at it from the wrong place, right? So it's like that's not what you should pay attention to, but it's still there. And the reason why I was trying to insist a little bit and kind of try to take your take on it is because I think that is something that's unavoidable going to come as society gets more secular and more scientific and more materialistic. So like this problem is not going to go away. And even though this holistic meaning that you're mentioning is obviously very important, I don't think that quite solves it. But I appreciate the answer, and it's a very good perspective. So something else that I also wanted to cover is that, at least for me, like Murdoch was kind of a fairly big influence for me to try to understand religion a little bit better, in the way that she talks about the good and kind of like the roots back to the Greeks, and then still maintaining a Christian link in some way. And that started to make a lot more sense to me, because I feel like a lot of the problem with religion is that it has its own internal language, its own internal set of symbols, which is, if you're not familiar with it, you read it, but you don't really read it. It's almost as if you're reading German and you don't know how to speak German. It's even worse because it is English, so you think that you know, but you actually don't know. And so I think when you secularize to some degree, I think it becomes more intelligible to normal people, and that's what happened to me when I was reading her work. But I think when you do that, you also dilute that a little bit, because, for example, the conception of that the Greeks had is not the conception that Christianity has, even though obviously Christianity was largely influenced by Greek thought. And so, in some sense, it repurposes or it enhances the Greek vision. And if I'm not mistaken, you kind of did some work on the Greeks, and obviously, plus your overall interest in the work on philosophy of religion. I'm just curious of like, how do you see this link, for example, of like the goods within Christian terms, and like how similar it is to the goods of the early Greeks? And then like, how do we navigate this relationship, and what are we losing when we highlight that similarity?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're thinking of that particularly in the context of Iris Murdoch's work. Yeah.
Yes, well, I would say it can be generalized.
Hmm.
I just mentioned her because I think she did a really good job of that,
Yeah.
and so I think it's a good example of the benefit of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, I mean, there is an interesting dialogue between classical Greek conceptions, um, largely inspired by Plato, and the Christian perspective. And St. Augustine, as you know, was a Platonist before he was a Christian. And Iris Murdoch seems to be drawn to a kind of Platonism. In fact, at one point in that book, Metaphysics as a Guide to Morals, she says, the good is the reality of which God is the dream. It's a beautiful phrase, but I think what she's saying is, she's saying that the Platonic conception, the form of the good, makes some sort of philosophical sense, whereas the idea of the personal God of Christianity is a bit of a dream or crude fantasy. Um, Now, actually, I think they're much closer than she suggests, because the way she talks about the good is that it's a kind of active power which has the power to transform our lives, that commands a response from us, that demands our allegiance. And when you start talking that way, it seems to me the gap narrows, because you're no longer the gap between Platonism and Christianity, because you're no longer talking about just an abstract form of the good, a definitional or conceptual thing, or even a real form, whatever that might be, but you're talking about something which has active power to make us change, and which we are drawn to as a source of meaning. And once you put it that way, I think, okay, that you may not express it in terms of dogmatic Christianity, but you're getting much closer to a theistic view, which is that there is an ultimate source of goodness, and we humans are configured in, although we so often go wrong and make mistakes, we're nonetheless configured in a way that makes us disposed to respond to the good and to recognize that pull, what philosophers call normativity, the, the authoritative nature of the good.
Yes, yeah, that was great. But it's interesting how different people have different perspectives, because like I obviously I completely understand kind of this commonality between them, and kind of this highlighting of the normativity essence of it, and that's very important. But something that I think that tends to leave out a little bit is the whole that I think makes Christianity fairly special compared to, for example, the conception of the good of the Greeks. And I think that connects a lot with morality as well, because okay, maybe let me sidetrack. So maybe let me say this first. I find it very interesting that a lot of times when you talk about religion, you often make this connection to like the source of all things, or the creator, right? Like there's definitely a connection there, and that's very complicated in the first place. But you have that bridge a lot, and I don't have it as much. Like to me, that's not so important. But it's interesting that for example, you put a lot of emphasis on morality and its connection with religion, and obviously that's a huge part, and that's again what kind of like made me more interested about Christianity. But as I got a bit deeper into tradition, and as I kind of read more and I experienced it more, something that I noticed is that I've been having this intuition that morality is not the main thing, and that gets a bit misleading if you put it in like Platonic terms, like, because the goods make sense within the context of Christianity, and Christianity has a certain way of directing you towards the world, and that is what shows the good and allows you to recognize the good, right? And yeah, and so, and just to finish, like, I think, yeah, I think that's why, like, you can't deal on this like abstraction, because otherwise you lose it a little bit. I think it's really helpful to, like, as a conversion mechanism of, like, look at how we can phrase this, and then you understand that religion is trying to say something, but you lose a lot in the translation, I think.
Yes, that's really the $64 question you raised there. Very, very interesting. So I think you're right in diagnosing that I do put the idea of the good very central, and that seems to me crucial. That to put it in religious terms, the goodness of God is primary and fundamental. Uh, if it wasn't there, then worship would be a form of superstition. We would just be we would be kowtowing to some magical or powerful force in order to get what we want. And that would be superstition, not religion. The goodness of God is what gives meaning and value to the religious life. Um, but it's not the only thing. I mean, I think um, the philosopher who said this has escaped me for the moment, but a philosopher of religion made the point that religion does two things. It says how things are and what things matter. How things are is a kind of cosmology, and what things matter is the theory of value and goodness. Um, and the religious perspective brings those together. So God is both the source of goodness, but also the source of the cosmos, reality. Now, that enables one to affirm something like, in fact, going back to Iris Murdoch, which you very aptly mentioned, Murdoch used this phrase, the sovereignty of the good. And it's very important for her that the good is not just any old desire or value amongst others, but is somehow sovereign. And it's this connection between cosmology and morality that enables Judaism, Christianity, and Islam to affirm the sovereignty of the good. That doesn't mean a crudely triumphalist, magical, that somehow God will intervene to make everything okay. It's not that. It's rather that there is a certain ultimate value to goodness, which is the key to how we should live and how we can find meaning in our lives.
Yes, amazing. Thank you. And just to maybe give a bit of extra context, I'm just curious how you answer this question, because, like, part of this whole problem, I suppose, that I just tried to articulate now, the context of where that came from is my question for a long time of, like, once you recognize the theological implications and the normativity of the goods, like you can say in a Platonic sense, like, a question that I asked myself for many years was, okay, why not just worship the good? Why do you need gods? Why do you need an embodied ideal? Why do you need any of it, right? And so it only has occurred to me recently that I think part of the answer to that is that the reason why there seems to be such a great affinity between the Platonic good and the good of Christianity in theory, but then not in practice, is precisely because that abstraction isn't enough. And only through ritual, only through story, you're trying to reach for the good, but maybe you just don't see the good in the same way, or you can't capture it in the same way, or you can't embody it in the same way. And so I'm just curious, like, how do you see this distinction and like this surplus of Christianity, whatever it is? What do you think it is offering, and like, what do you think the mechanism is?
Mm. Yes, that's very nicely put, if I may say so. I think the dimension that's crucial here is praxis. It is, as you imply, practical engagement in forms of worship. I've used the phrase the primacy of praxis in some places in my work. And in that Humane Perspective book, there's a paper called, the final chapter called Engagement, Immersion, and Enactment, which is published some years ago now. And the idea is that in worship, we don't just affirm the good, our allegiance to the good, but we somehow enact it. We are, the American philosopher Robert Adams, talked about being for the good. And the liturgy is a way that people kind of enact that being for the good so that it, as it were, is incorporated into their daily, weekly spiritual routines. A lot of philosophers, I I hesitate to criticize my philosophical colleagues, but I think a lot of them are very left hemisphere thinkers. That's to say, they want to consider things in a very detached and abstract way. The point about forms of worship is that we engage not just as affirming the truth of a doctrine, but as enacting it in movement, in song, in solidarity with others around us, in liturgy, which is a form of stylized service which plugs us into a tradition. And so those dimensions, if you like, the physical dimensions, the emotional dimensions, the whole structures of worship are very important. And it may be that a certain type of person could live just with affirming the sovereignty of the good in a very philosophical and abstract way. But I think Iris Murdoch shows in her novels that there are pitfalls in thinking you can solve life's problems merely as, you know, her novels are full of characters who are rather philosophers who are very clever, but who are not actually in touch with the deep feelings that drive them. Philosophers are very good at rationalizing things and often very unself-aware. And the self-awareness is fostered not just by discussion or theory, but by praxis as well. So
Yeah.
sorry, that's a rather long-winded answer, but I think it's relevant to the question
No,
you
no,
raised.
yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate it, and I think it's very insightful. I haven't read her novels yet, and I need to start. I have one, but I keep delaying it. But yeah, that was fantastic. Now, somewhat of a random jump, but a question that I really wanted to ask you as well is that I think we're witnessing to some degree a revival of religion, and I've heard you argue the opposite a little bit, so there could be some debate there. But just for the sake of argument, I think at least there's an ongoing reevaluation of what religion means, and I think that will eventually be accompanied by growth in the most bare sense. And I think one of the contributors, if I can oversimplify a little bit, is psychedelics due to the Renaissance, the psychedelic Renaissance, if in this century. And I don't think you've talked about that, at least from what I've seen. So I'd like to explore that a little bit. And I think the reason why that's the case is because it forces you to confront spirituality in some way. Like, you can't reject it. Like, even if you want to attack it and dismiss it, like, you still need to engage with it. It's very hard to ignore, I think. And so it brings the topic to the surface. So I would like to ask you, like, how do you view psychedelics? How do you see it fit within philosophy of religion? And also, kind of an extra question is that, given that the original psychedelic revolution was in the 60s, you somewhat experienced it firsthand from a cultural perspective. So I'm also curious if that personal experience affected how you see the subject now as they get into mainstream culture again.
Yeah, I suppose it does in a way. The complications about psychedelic stuff, because it was associated with certainly when I was growing up and in my early adulthood in the 60s and 70s, was often associated with a very fluid sense of life. You just went with the flow. And that seemed very liberating, I think, in comparison with the rather grey, tightly constrained post-war world of the 50s. But it also led to great trouble, I think, and people trying to live without structures, and often came to grief for that reason. What do I think about it? Well, this connects with the question of spirituality. What is spiritual praxis about? Which you touched on earlier. It seems to, well, let me just state my own view. It seems to me crucial to authentic spirituality that spiritual experience is a response. It's a response to something beyond us. It's not just purely endogenous. So when we respond to the beauties of the natural world, or to the wonder of great works of art, or to the moral imperative, the normative dimension you referred to earlier, we feel a response called forth from something other than ourselves. Now, many people who extol psychedelics, including many contemporary atheist thinkers, like Sam Harris, for example, basically see spiritual experience as endogenous. It's generated by internal feelings. So he thinks, well, you can get it by fasting, but you can get it by taking a drug, or the way it's generated is in a certain sense irrelevant. So it's a certain kind of internal state which leads you to say, wow. I'm putting it in sort of 60s psychedelic term. Wow, man, that's great. Now, if that's the case, if these are just sort of strange, weird, quirky experiences humans get when their brains are zapped with chemicals, then there's no real significance to them. They may make you feel good for a while, and they may make you up and then down, but there's no ultimate significance there. They're just psychological states, brain states, in fact, on a very strict atheist materialist view. And yet, the sorts of experiences we're talking about have been characterized in the tradition, in literature, in music, in religion, as of profound significance for understanding ourselves and our place in the world. So I think there is a divide here between religious or quasi-religious forms of spirituality and the cultivations of internal states which operate within a purely materialist framework. I haven't perhaps expressed that as precisely as I might have done, but I think there's a broad contrast there. So if focusing on your question, if psychedelic means the second, just an endogenous series of states triggered by LSD or something of that kind, then I don't see how they can have this transcendent significance, which I would ascribe to them.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's very tricky. So, first of all, I would say I'm not sure if that's exactly Sam Harris's position. I would say from my understanding, not that I like Sam Harris at all, quite the opposite. But I think his argument is more the fact that even though you can access these states, that the point is that there's several mechanisms through which you can experience this state, which he considers as true, which is then, and he considers as true based on his metaphysics, let's say, even though he thinks he doesn't have metaphysics. But I would say that's slightly different, but I still understand where you're coming from. But when you mention this difference of like, if it's just an internal experience, or if you're reaching for something beyond, like there's no possible way we can unpack this now, but I feel that's a dichotomy that's actually hurting us. Like I don't think, and I don't think, and I think that dichotomy is already part of a modernist interpretation. Like I think tradition has always viewed, the macrocosm in the microcosm and so on. So it's like, I think the fact that I think this this inner experience and reaching out for the transcendent, they're kind of the same thing. You're just describing it in a different language, I think, or at least from a different perspective at the bare minimum. And but yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I think, and I also agree with kind of what you said about the dangers of dissolution of structure, which is what we witness a lot culturally in the 60s. But I think now we're in a better place to deal with that for a variety of reasons. But yeah, that was very insightful. Yes. Thank you.
There's a volume shortly coming out on this sort of area, which is a dialogue between atheists and religious adherents with respect to spiritual experience in particular. And I'm not sure I have the full title details yet, but I'll perhaps mention them to you in an email afterwards, so in case you want to give that reference. But it's been a very interesting dialogue, and I certainly wouldn't want to. I think Sam Harris is a very eloquent writer, and I think he certainly believes these experiences are of great importance, so he's not dissing them. But for me, there's a lack of a vehicle, that religion provides essentially a spiritual vehicle where these experiences can be set to change the metaphor, in a framework of meaning, which links them with our understanding of the nature of reality and of what's required of us as human beings.
Yes, very much so. I completely agree with that. So I know we're already over time, so I'd like to ask you just one final question, if you don't mind, and you can be as concise as you'd like. So you've had a very, very long, career in philosophy. So, if you have to look back at your entire life, primarily through a lens of philosophy, but if you want, you can connect it to other things or deviate slightly. But when you take this reflective stance and you consider everything that you've learned and everything that you've achieved in philosophy, what would you say is the most important to you? And what would you say is kind of like one of your biggest mistakes that you've made?
Yeah, I think I've certainly since retiring from full-time teaching, which has been 10 years or so now, um, I have become more and more interested in the philosophy of religion, as we've been discussing today, and had the privilege of meeting many theologians as well as philosophers, and that's opened new doors to some extent. Um, I think what I've found the most rewarding about that is that philosophy has ceased to be a purely academic subject, a way of earning a living, if you like, which was certainly, I'm grateful for the career which provided food and shelter and so on. We all need to earn a living, so there's nothing wrong with that. But it is a great privilege if one can connect one is working on with the deepest questions about the value and meaning of life. So there's a sort of integration there. And I suppose I would say that the hardest lesson to learn, both for philosophers, but people in general, is the lesson of integrity, how to connect the different parts of our life together so that we don't compartmentalize, um, but try to move towards some sort of coherent goal. Not to, Aristotle said in the Eudemian Ethics, not to have your life planned towards some end is a sign of great folly. And I think if you're asking for mistakes, perhaps if I look back on some of my earlier life, I think it was not, as it were, it was very ad hoc, geared to the solution of particular issues and problems, but without any integrated sense of the goals. I think we are teleological beings. We are configured towards an end. And that's really part of what I would try to do in my philosophical work now, to articulate that teleological vision. By that I mean some sort of purposive vision, where one's intellectual life, one's emotional life, and indeed one's personal life, um, in some way makes sense. And perhaps that sounds a bit pompous, and clearly I'm articulating an ideal, which I wouldn't claim to live up to, and I think few of us do. But having that ideal as there, I think is something I've come to think is very precious, both in work and in life.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, that was a great answer, and yeah, super helpful to hear, and also in relationship to your work and kind of like this articulation, maybe something that maybe you would like to hear is that as I've engaged deeper and deeper with religion over the years, like my partner isn't religious at all, and so she's she doesn't get it, to put it straightforward, and I'm trying to sometimes nudge her a little bit, and one time she asked me, like, just give, you read so many books, Tiago, just give me a book that helps me understand why this certain kind of worldview makes sense. And that was a surprisingly difficult question to answer, because like everything depends on something else. It's like, okay, if you want to understand my worldview, like here's like 300 books, like get started, right? That's not convenient. But when I think about it, I actually think that your book In Search of the Soul is actually a really good candidate for that answer, where it talks about things that have true depth while being accessible. So I think your work is very important, and I think with great benefit to current culture, I would say.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you so much. And it's been a great pleasure for talking, and thank you for your most interesting questions. I'll look forward to seeing you'll send me the link, no doubt, to when this is up on your podcast.
Yeah,
So
we'll do so. So yeah, thank you for coming. It was an absolute,
great to talk to you.
yes, great conversation. Is there anything that you would like to plug about your work? I don't know if you're writing the next
Um,
book or something.
I don't think you mentioned recommending a book to your partner. There's a much smaller one than On the Soul. In fact, it's so small it's just a little pamphlet almost called How Can I Believe? And that's a sort of little digest of two separate books, one called How to Believe, and the other Why Believe, which are both kind of defenses of the religious framework, very much in the terms we've been discussing today. So those I would I'd be happy if people found those to be helpful. The other one I mentioned, The Humane Perspective, is unfortunately, although it's quite a slim paper, hardback, is unfortunately priced exorbitantly, I think, by Oxford University Press. So it's at £70, which I think is much too expensive for most people to fork out. But a lot of the papers that um, from which that material was developed are available on my website, and there's quite a lot on the website too, um, which people might find helpful. But thank you so much for your questions. It's been great talking to you.
Okay, so now I'm just going to talk a little bit about my book, as I promised. And so it's just for you to have a better sense of what it is about so you can decide if it's something that you'd be interested or not. So, first of all, the book is about philosophy. Like, it's deeply philosophical. So, obviously, if you don't like philosophy, it's not going to be the best book for you. So, I'll outline my philosophical views, the kind of experiences, the kind of arguments, the kind of worldviews that I think make sense. And I kind of develop those ideas throughout the book. And so it involves, to some degree, metaphysics, it involves ethics, it involves ontology, all that stuff. Now, another aspect of the book is that it's very personal. So even though it is philosophical, it's not like the typical philosophy book that's kind of like just very abstract, formal arguments. So it's about how philosophy influences my life and also how my life influences philosophy. And so I cover very deeply personal matters, right? I try to look back at my life and like try to make sense of it and try to like philosophically analyze it and think about my future life again with this kind of like philosophical lens. And so all that philosophy, I think, to some degree, at the end, comes into fruition in my own life. And so, and yeah, talk about my struggles, my insecurities, the loss of my mother that passed away a few years ago. So, all that kind of stuff. So it kind of reads like a memoir, to some degree. That's kind of like a good way to frame it. Now, thirdly, it's a book about psychedelics, or rather, not just about psychedelics, but also written while on psychedelics. So the subtitle is called A Psychedelic Memoir. And so the book is a collection of kind of like trip logs over the span of like 7 years. And so, and on each session, I basically have a psychedelic experience, and then, I write about whatever I want, but inevitably that leads to kind of like philosophical and personal explorations. And so, if this kind of thing appeals to you, of like reading about someone having a psychedelic experience, if kind of like altered states of consciousness is something that you're kind of interested in, yeah, then this might be the kind of book for you. And so I kind of like sketched out three main themes. So right, so it's just like it's about philosophy, it's deeply personal, kind of like a memoir, and third, it's about psychedelics and psychedelic experiences. And all of that kind of culminates into one final theme. And you can kind of see that throughout the book, I kind of build upon these three things in order to reach to something else. And that something else is religion. And so even though the starting point of the book is philosophy, I get more and more drawn into religion, and I explain why that is. And so it is, to some degree, a deeply religious book as well. And to some degree, it's also my journey from being anti-religion to viewing religion as absolutely fundamental to human life. And so, yeah, if any of this of what I just said now sounds remotely interesting to you, then feel free to pick it up. It's available on Amazon. Right now, it's paperback. Maybe in the future, I'll have other formats as well. But yeah, I hope you like it. Cheers.